In the heart of the deepest night, when the outer world has receded to a whisper and the insistent clamor of daily anxieties has finally begun to lose its grip, allow the mind to drift toward the quiet, rhythmic unfolding of a distant narrative. The words, precisely chosen and deliberately paced, are not a demand for attention, but a gentle, steady current, intended only to soothe the restless edges of awareness. Surrender to the deliberate slowness of the description, the measured cadence of each phrase, and the meticulous, almost tedious detail. There is no urgency here, only the soft progression of time and place. Let the deliberate inertia of the tale serve as an anchor, pulling consciousness down, into the calm, untroubled depths of rest. Close the eyes and permit the gentle, insistent weight of the prose to become the last sensation, fading slowly into the profound and undisturbed silence of sleep. The late October evening had descended upon Atheria House with a chilling, almost malevolent insistence, wrapping the sprawling, grey stone structure in a mantle of sea fog so thick and pervasive that it seemed less a meteorological condition and more a physical, suffocating presence. The house itself, an architectural monument to a forgotten era of minor gentry wealth, stood precariously balanced on the cliffs overlooking Porthaven Bay, its numerous gables and chimney stacks dissolving intermittently into the swirling grey vapor that rose ceaselessly from the churning, unseen waters below. Within the grand drawing-room, a space characterized by an oppressive abundance of dark, heavily carved oak and velvets of a faded, mournful crimson, the atmosphere was one of forced, almost brittle conviviality, a stark contrast to the elemental chaos raging just beyond the tall, mullioned windows. Monsieur Étienne LaBorde, a man whose professional life as an esteemed yet obscure academic linguist had recently concluded, found himself an accidental and reluctant guest in this strange, isolating environment. He was a figure of unremarkable height, yet possessing an undeniable presence, derived entirely from the profound, analytical intensity of his pale, observant eyes that habitually noticed the slightest tremor in a hand, the fleeting hypocrisy in a smile, or the subtle misuse of an article in conversational French. He sat now, not too close to the fire, but within its gentle radius, occupying an antique wingback chair whose embroidered tapestry depicted a scene of wholly inappropriate pastoral cheerfulness. He held a cup of tepid Earl Grey, the floral aroma barely penetrating the heavier, more dominant sense of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint, metallic tang of the sea air that managed to seep even through the tightly closed frames. The group gathered, a disparate collection of individuals assembled by the capricious and often cruel will of their host, Lord Percival Thornley, consisted, in LaBorde's immediate and silent estimation, of 7 souls, including himself, all bound together by the invisible yet utterly binding chains of dependency or obligation to the master of the house. Lord Thornley, a man whose wealth was matched only by the refined unpleasantness of his character, had a distinct and unsettling talent for collecting people whose lives he could subtly or overtly manipulate, much as a collector might arrange a set of exquisite but utterly inert butterflies. The first among them, naturally, was Ada Thornley, the hostess and Lord Percival's second, considerably younger wife. She occupied the center of the room's conversational circle, though her contribution to the chatter was minimal, consisting mostly of brief, melodic laughs that sounded curiously detached, like notes struck on an instrument far away. Her dress, a flowing gown of bottle-green silk, was perhaps too vibrant for the house's somber disposition, and the cascade of fiery auburn hair that framed her delicate, almost fragile features made her a point of intense visual interest, a single splash of color in a monochromatic painting. LaBorde watched her hand, weighed down by the massive, inherited ruby ring, traced the rim of her sherry glass. He observed not the glass, but the faint tremor, a nervous energy that seemed entirely disconnected from the placid smile she offered Major Thorne. The tremor, he catalogued internally, was not one of fear, but of profound, sustained irritation. Seated opposite her, and attempting with a rather cumbersome, almost desperate charm to engage her in light banter about the rigors of the London season, was Major Quinton Thorne. The Major was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and possessing a florid complexion that spoke of a recent, substantial retreat from the tropics and perhaps a rather less substantial retreat from the bottle. His tweed suit, though meticulously tailored, looked somehow ill at ease in the room, too robust for the house's quiet decay. His conversation, all loud declarations about polo and the deplorable state of the international bond market, was punctuated by a too frequent, almost performative heartiness. LaBorde, the quiet linguist, noted the strained emphasis on financial stability in his remarks, a verbal tic that suggested, quite strongly, the exact opposite of what he claimed. Thorne was indebted, deeply, and Lord Percival was clearly the creditor. In a corner, partially obscured by an enormous, dust-laden fiddle-leaf fig plant, sat George Kellington, Lord Percival's distant cousin and the presumptive, though perhaps not intended, heir. George was a man built of shadows and muted tones. His clothing was impeccably but anonymously tailored in shades of gray and charcoal, and his physical posture was perpetually curved inward, as if attempting to reduce his own presence to the smallest possible volume. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low, self-effacing murmur that one had to lean in to catch, usually offering a brief, almost apologetic agreement to someone else's point. He was currently reading, or pretending to read, a leather-bound volume of obscure 18th-century poetry, though LaBorde noticed the same page had remained unturned for the better part of a quarter of an hour. The faint, almost imperceptible sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the room's cool temperature, was noted and filed away. George Kellington, LaBorde concluded, was a man consumed by the nervous hope of an inheritance he felt he did not deserve, or perhaps, the desperate need for one he believed he did. The other inhabitants of the small circle were less visually dramatic but equally instructive in their demeanor. Gwendolen Marsh, Lord Percival's personal assistant for the last decade, was a study in methodical rigidity. Her hair was drawn back so tightly from her scalp that it gave her an almost perpetually startled expression, though her gaze, when it met one's own, was remarkably steady and disconcertingly devoid of personal warmth. She was occupied with correcting a sheaf of documents, her small, precise hand moving over the paper with a rapid, almost mechanical efficiency. She was the gatekeeper to Lord Percival's affairs, the one who knew the exact degree of ruin or salvation he held over each person present. Her silence was not shy, LaBorde determined, but possessive, a form of active containment of classified information. Next to her, sipping a medicinal-looking brandy, sat Dr. Alastair Finch, the family physician. Dr. Finch was a man who looked perpetually harassed by the vast, insurmountable weight of modern medical knowledge. He was thin, slight, and his movements were jerky, nervous, like a small bird trapped indoors. His eyes darted constantly toward the doorway, suggesting a man who wished intensely to be elsewhere, perhaps attending to a more straightforward case of influenza or a simple broken limb, rather than the complex, social ailments that inevitably accrued around a man like Lord Percival. He offered a non-committal sigh every few minutes, a perfect reflection of his professional and personal position, obligated to attend, yet powerless to intervene. The sound of the wind outside was not a steady drone, but a series of distinct, mournful howls that seemed to climb and fall in pitch, occasionally punctuated by the frantic rattling of a loose window pane somewhere on the upper floor. The rain, which had begun as a delicate spatter, was now a violent, continuous drumming against the glass, creating a distorting sheet that rendered the garden visible only as a series of blurred, dark green and black shapes, lending the entire room a feeling of being submerged, detached from the habitable world. It was into this carefully constructed, socially charged quietude that Lord Percival Thornley finally made his entrance, precisely 45 minutes after the agreed-upon time for the pre-dinner sherry. His habitual tardiness was a calculated social weapon, a small, subtle demonstration of his absolute control over the schedules and patience of everyone present. He stood framed in the massive doorway, a short, bulky man whose face was dominated by a pair of heavily lidded eyes that seemed to miss nothing and forgive less. His clothing, a dinner jacket of antiquated yet expensive cut, somehow looked both immaculate and slightly ridiculous, a costume for a play no one wished to attend. "Apologies for the delay," he announced, his voice carrying a dry, reedy quality that never rose above a conversational volume yet possessed an undeniable sting. "A matter of considerable financial import required my immediate attention. One must, after all, keep the wolves from the door. Though," he added, his gaze sweeping over the room and lingering momentarily on Major Thorne and George Kellington with an unpleasant, predatory amusement, "sometimes one finds the wolves are already inside the house, don't you agree?" The silence that followed this declaration was of a different quality than the previous quiet. It was tense, charged, a low hum of concealed animosity. Lord Percival moved deliberately across the room, pausing briefly to take a glass of the sherry that had been awaiting his arrival. LaBorde noted the slight, almost microscopic contraction of Ada Thornley's jaw muscles. She had evidently endured this routine countless times. The conversation that followed, prior to the butler's announcement of dinner, was entirely dominated by Lord Percival, who had a particular flair for extracting tiny, humiliating details from the lives of his guests and presenting them back to the company as thinly veiled anecdotes of personal failure or moral compromise. He spoke at length about Major Thorne's recent, disastrous investment in a Chilean copper mine, turning the man's florid face a shade deeper crimson, and then transitioned, with seamless cruelty, to an exhaustive, publicly voiced critique of George Kellington's latest, entirely unsuccessful attempt to secure a position teaching Latin at a minor preparatory school, thereby ensuring that George sank deeper into the embrace of the wingback chair. LaBorde, meanwhile, merely observed, the delicate dance of social torture and endured humiliation passing before his keen, analytic gaze. He was studying the room not as a scene of potential conflict, but as a meticulously prepared stage. The placement of the objects, the distance between the chairs, the route from the door to the fireplace, all were now being absorbed into his memory, forming the foundational spatial and temporal blueprint upon which any future disruption would have to be mapped. The world, for LaBorde, was a text to be parsed, a linguistic puzzle where the gestures and movements were the true grammar. When the butler, a man named Hilliard whose face was a mask of long-suffering professional impassivity, finally announced that dinner was served, the relief that swept through the assembled company was palpable, a nervous, collective exhale. The movement from the drawing room to the dining hall was swift, a silent, desperate flight from the oppressive atmosphere created by the host. The dining room, an even more cavernous and poorly lit chamber than the drawing room, was a study in heavy, overbearing opulence. The central mahogany table, polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflected the flickering light of the numerous candles held within the tall, Baroque silver candelabra, creating distorted, elongated shadows that danced unsettlingly upon the dark, wainscoted walls. The air here was heavy with the scent of roasted meat, Madeira wine, and the faint, dusty perfume of decaying floral arrangements. The dinner itself proceeded with a somber formality that felt entirely misplaced given the small size of the company. Hilliard and a junior footman moved with disciplined silence, serving the various courses, a rather heavy consommé, an overly rich saddle of lamb with a disappointing side of understeamed asparagus, and a final, ponderous plum pudding that was more of a structural commitment than a dessert. Lord Percival, strategically positioned at the head of the long table, continued his relentless, low-voiced monologue, which now focused exclusively on the inadequacies of the various legal and financial professionals who managed his considerable estate. LaBorde was seated between Gwendolyn Marsh and Dr. Finch, an arrangement that allowed him to observe the majority of the table without appearing to do so. Gwendolyn Marsh ate with a quiet, almost surgical precision, her attention oscillating between her plate and Lord Percival's verbal torrent, seemingly evaluating the strategic implications of his every uttered phrase. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, pushed his food around with a silver fork, his appetite clearly suffering under the dual pressure of social obligation and the host's proximity. The most critical observations LaBorde made during this protracted, uncomfortable meal centered around the subtle movements of the hands and the glasses. It was a rule of the house, apparently, that the footman managed the wine service, refilling the glasses of hock and claret with methodical, regular efficiency. Lord Percival, however, consumed a fortified port that Hilliard poured directly into his private, lead crystal glass, a unique piece with a slight, almost imperceptible discoloration in the stem. This specific glass, LaBorde noted with a mental tic, never left the immediate vicinity of Lord Percival's place setting, except to be refilled by the butler Hilliard alone. As the meal concluded, the footman cleared the remnants of the plum pudding, and the conversation, such as it was, began to wind down, sputtering out like a damp fuse. It was a few minutes before 10 o'clock. The storm outside had only intensified, the wind now sounding like a physical roar tearing across the cliff top. "We shall retire to the study for port and coffee, gentlemen," Lord Percival announced, pushing himself back from the table with a slight, almost wheezing effort. "Ada, my dear, perhaps you and Miss Marsh could attend to some of the post-dinner business. There is that matter concerning the charity auction accounts." This was, LaBorde correctly interpreted, a dismissal of the ladies and a subtle declaration of the continuing importance of Miss Marsh's professional loyalty over her social duties. Ada's placid smile did not waver, but LaBorde saw the instantaneous darkening in her eyes, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The four men, Lord Percival, Major Thorn, George Kellington, and Dr. Finch, followed Lord Percival out of the dining room and down the long, heavily tiled corridor toward the north wing, where the Lord's private study was located. LaBorde, pausing to retrieve his own handkerchief from his dinner jacket pocket, allowed himself to fall a few paces behind the group, granting himself a momentary spatial and intellectual distance from the others. He noticed that the polished corridor floor, reflecting the light of the single gas lamp at the far end, showed the distinct, overlapping trail of the men's footprints, Major Thorn's heavy stride, George Kellington's hesitant, shuffling steps, Dr. Finch's quick, nervous pace, and Lord Percival's shorter, more deliberate marks. The study itself was a chamber of almost hermetically sealed male authority, a shrine to commerce and personal power. Every surface was covered in dark leather, embossed paper, or heavily veined marble. The air was dry, almost suffocating, bearing the heavy, cloying scent of old tobacco, leather dressing, and decades of stagnant paperwork. A small, self-contained fire crackled listlessly in the stone hearth. The men settled into four massive, identical leather armchairs arranged around a low, round ottoman. Hilliard, who had preceded them, had already placed a silver tray on the ottoman. On the tray sat a squat, cut-glass decanter filled with a deep, ruby-red liquid, the port, for small, footed crystal glasses identical to the one Lord Percival had used at dinner, and a small, silver coffee service. Hilliard, with the silent efficiency of a well-oiled machine, moved to the ottoman. He carefully poured 4 exact measures of the port into the 4 glasses. LaBorde watched him closely. Hilliard did not touch the glasses, nor did he linger. He simply poured the wine, placed the decanter back on the tray, and without a word, retreated to the doorway, awaiting further instructions. Lord Percival, however, waved a dismissive hand. "That will be all, Hilliard. You may instruct Mrs. Pendleton to make preparations for my late-night toddy in precisely 2 hours. No sooner, no later." "Very good, my lord," Hilliard murmured, his face utterly blank, and he departed, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a low, hydraulic sigh. The silence returned, but it was now broken by the small, rhythmic clinking of the glasses. Lord Percival reached out and took the glass nearest him. Major Thorn, with a sigh of anticipated relief, took the next. George Kellington, hesitantly, took the third. Dr. Finch, after a brief pause, took the fourth. Lord Percival raised his glass, not in a toast, but in a gesture of possessive self-regard. "To the continuation of the Thornley legacy," he announced, his voice dry and brittle. The other 3 men murmured an assent that ranged from Major Thorn's enthusiastic, if strained, compliance to George Kellington's barely audible whisper. All 4 men then raised the crystal to their lips. LaBorde, observing from the entrance where he had paused for a moment to adjust his cravat, saw the liquid swallowed. It was Lord Percival who lowered his glass first. His eyes, fixed momentarily on the empty fireplace, widened just a fraction. His hand, which rested upon the leather arm of his chair, clenched suddenly, the knuckles turning white against the polished brown hide. A sound, a small, involuntary gasp that was half choke and half exhalation, escaped his lips. The movement was subtle, yet its effect was immediate and catastrophic. He lifted his other hand and pressed it, not to his chest, but to his abdomen, directly beneath the ribs. The color that had been concentrated in his face, a ruddy, imperious hue, drained away instantly, leaving a mask of ashy, gray pallor. The glass slipped from his grasp and fell perhaps 6 inches onto the thick Persian carpet, landing without shattering, merely emitting a dull, muffled thud. "Percival?" Dr. Finch asked, his voice spiking with a nervous alarm that was instantly professional. Lord Percival did not respond. He leaned forward abruptly, his body seeming to lose its internal rigidity, becoming a heavy, uncoordinated mass. His head snapped forward, his chin hitting his chest with an audible crack. Then, with a slow, appalling certainty, his entire frame slid down in the leather armchair, ending in a slumped, fetal position, completely motionless. His eyes remained slightly open, fixed on the polished mahogany floor, yet utterly devoid of recognition or light. The silence that followed this collapse was absolute, a profound physical vacuum that sucked all previous sound and life from the room. It was Major Thorn who broke it, a soundless expulsion of breath that sounded like a deflating bellows. Dr. Finch, galvanized by the instant necessity of his profession, leaped from his chair with an agility none would have expected from his nervous disposition. He was instantly kneeling by the slumped form, his small, precise hands checking the wrist and then the carotid artery with rapid, almost frantic movements. He straightened up after what seemed an eternity but was perhaps only 20 seconds, his face now a sickly, mottled green. "He's gone," the doctor announced, his voice thin and high, barely above a whisper. "He's quite dead." There was no struggle, no sound, barely a twitch. Whatever it was instantaneous, catastrophic. Major Thorn, his face a sudden portrait of absolute shock, stumbled back, knocking a small end table and causing a miniature bronze bust of Julius Caesar to wobble precariously. "Good God, Finch! What are you saying? An attack? A seizure?" Dr. Finch shook his head slowly, his eyes wide and fixed on the body. No. No, this was not natural. The speed, the totality of the collapse, it suggests something far more deliberate. Something violent and corrosive. Poison, Major. I would stake my entire medical reputation on it. Lord Percival Thornley has been murdered. LaBorde, who had stood silently at the periphery, now moved, his steps quiet and entirely self-possessed. He walked past the horrified Major, past the paralyzed George Kellington, and approached the body. He did not touch the corpse, but knelt momentarily, observing the precise angle of the slump, the almost unnaturally relaxed positioning of the limbs. Then, he rose and turned his attention to the 4 port glasses. They stood side by side on the ottoman. 3 were still half full, resting on the coasters. The 4th, Lord Percival's glass, lay on the carpet, empty. Dr. Finch, LaBorde's voice was calm, almost conversational, cutting through the rising tide of hysteria. "I understand that you, Major Thorn, and Monsieur Kellington also consumed a measure of this port. Is that correct?" Major Thorn nodded dumbly, still breathing in short, shallow gasps. George Kellington merely stared, his eyes fixed on the empty glass on the floor. "Yes," Dr. Finch confirmed, swallowing hard. "We all drank together." "Why? If it was poison, why are we standing here?" LaBorde's pale eyes, intensely focused, moved from the decanter, to the glasses, and then to the dead man. "Because, doctor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, analytical tone, "if the killer was not extraordinarily foolish, and no killer who operates with such speed and precision is foolish, then only one glass was poisoned. And that glass, I observe, was the one designated for Lord Percival. The killer did not wish to commit a mass murder, only an execution." The Major suddenly surged forward, a wave of delayed realization washing over him. But Hilliard poured them. He poured them all from the same decanter. "The decanter is still full of port, for God's sake. Look, if he poured 4 glasses from the decanter, then the poison must be in the decanter, and we should all be dead." "A logical conclusion, Major," LaBorde agreed, his gaze now shifting to the heavy silver decanter. "But perhaps, only perhaps, the poison was not in the decanter at all. Perhaps the poison was in the glass." He moved to the ottoman and, with extreme care, picked up one of the remaining, half-full glasses, holding it by the base between his thumb and index finger. He held it up to the firelight. It was perfectly clear, the ruby-red port sparkling innocently. He placed it down and then retrieved the crystal from the carpet, avoiding contact with the rim. This glass, too, looked identical. "We must summon the authorities immediately, Dr. Finch," LaBorde instructed, his voice now assuming an air of quiet, undeniable command. "In the interim, no one, and I mean no one, is to touch anything. The scene must remain pristine. I shall, with your permission, act as a temporary custodian of the evidence. I have, in my time, assisted certain branches of the Parisian law enforcement with matters of particular complexity." Dr. Finch, relieved to find a point of professional direction in the chaos, nodded rapidly. "Of course. I will use the telephone in the morning room. But, who are you, sir? You speak with such authority." "I am merely a man who despises disorder, doctor," LaBorde replied, his eyes never leaving the dead man on the carpet. "And a man who has just witnessed a moment of absolute, catastrophic disorder. My name is LaBorde. And the first task, before all else, is to ensure that the killer does not escape, nor that the crucial grammar of this situation is erased." The process of informing the rest of the household was carried out with a hushed, almost funereal dignity, meticulously managed by Dr. Finch under LaBorde's silent guidance. Ada Thornley, the young widow, received the news in the drawing-room with a studied, almost professional shock, sinking onto a silk divan and pressing a lace handkerchief to her eyes. LaBorde observed the perfect symmetry of her grief, no sudden movements, no raw, uncontrolled cries, merely a slow, theatrical collapse. He noted the dry patch of fabric on the handkerchief when she finally lowered it. Her grief was performative, an exercise in social expectation, not a genuine explosion of emotional pain. Gwendolyn Marsh, the secretary, reacted with a controlled, almost glacial froideur. Her first words were not of shock or sympathy, but a crisp, technical query, which accounts were left unsettled. And where are the keys to the safe? Her immediate prioritization of business over personal tragedy spoke volumes to LaBorde about the true nature of her relationship with the deceased, professional, transactional, and entirely lacking in sentiment. She was the one who knew the reasons for the murder, the precise details of the financial web that had ensnared the others. Her knowledge was her shield, and perhaps, her own secret motive. Mrs. Pendleton, the long-serving, thin-lipped housekeeper, whose face seemed carved from the same grey stone as the house itself, arrived from the back passages. Her reaction was perhaps the most genuine, though cloaked in the rigid propriety of her station. She simply placed a gnarled hand over her mouth and murmured, "Oh, my lord, after all these years of trouble." Her words, though few, hinted at a vast, subterranean history of conflict and strife within the walls of Atheria House, a history that LaBorde knew would hold the true key to the present catastrophe. She was the witness to decades of secrets, the silent observer of Lord Percival's slow, systematic corrosion of the lives around him. LaBorde spent the next hour alone in the study, guarding the scene of the crime until the local constabulary could arrive, a process he knew would take time given the isolation of Porthaven Bay and the severity of the storm. He used this time not to search, but to absorb. He sat on the edge of a chair, his eyes moving with slow, meticulous purpose over every single object within the room's confines. He began with the ottoman, the epicenter of the drama. The 4 crystal glasses remained, Lord Percival's empty one on the rug, the other 3 on the tray. He confirmed his earlier hypothesis. The 3 remaining glasses were visibly identical to the empty one. The decanter, still half full of port, stood tall and imposing. He noted the single droplet of wine that had run down the side of the decanter and dried in a nearly invisible streak on the silver tray, a minor, unimportant detail, yet one that confirmed the butler had only poured the wine and had not touched the individual glasses afterward. His gaze moved to the massive mahogany desk that dominated the far wall. It was a masterpiece of organized chaos, piles of neatly labeled documents, a heavy brass inkwell, a massive, bound ledger, and an ornate silver cigar box. Crucially, on the right-hand corner of the desk, just beneath the rim of an unread copy of the Times, LaBorde observed a very small, almost microscopic cluster of white crystalline powder. It was too fine to be sugar, too deliberate to be simple dust. He did not touch it, but simply filed the observation away. If the poison had been placed in the glass before Hilliard poured the port, where had the killer performed the final, delicate preparation? The study, it seemed, was not just the scene of the death, but perhaps the scene of the preparation. His thoughts now began to arrange themselves into the logical, linear sequence of the crime. The opportunity, the short window of time between the dinner and the arrival of the men in the study. The method, a fast-acting, lethal poison placed in the victim's specific glass. The logistics, the poison must have been introduced either before the men entered the study or after they entered but before they drank the port. Since all 4 men were in the study when Hilliard poured the port, and the decanter was apparently clean, the poison could not have been introduced at the table during dinner. It must have been in Lord Percival's specific, designated glass. But how was the killer to know which glass was Lord Percival's? Hilliard had poured 4 identical measures into 4 identical glasses. The men had simply taken the one nearest to them on the tray. This was the fundamental logistical paradox. Unless LaBorde walked slowly around the ottoman. He re-examined the placement of the chairs. They were massive, immovable armchairs, and they surrounded the low ottoman in a perfect, equidistant square. However, Lord Percival's chair was subtly different. It was positioned directly beneath a massive, rather ugly 17th-century landscape painting, ensuring that his own light source was slightly dimmer than the others, a minor point of visual superiority. He looked at the glasses again. They were identical. He looked at the decanter. No mechanism of delivery there. He sat down, closing his eyes, and reconstructed the scene, not through his eyes, but through the grammar of movement. Lord Percival, the host, had led the way. He had entered the room, and by habit, by right, he would have occupied that chair, the head position, under the painting. The others would have naturally fanned out around him. When Hilliard placed the tray, the placement of the glasses would have been relative to the chair, not an absolute, randomized geometry. Hilliard, trained in the ritual, would have placed one glass directly in front of the host's chair. Therefore, the killer must have either, A, known this ritual and poisoned the glass before Hilliard brought the tray in, unlikely, as Hilliard would have noticed tampering. B, poisoned the glass after the tray was set down, but before Lord Percival took his drink. But the men were all present. They all walked together. There was no moment of privacy. LaBorde stood up abruptly, his mind discarding the impossibility and seizing on the one piece of evidence he had neglected. The desk. The white crystalline powder. The powder was on the desk, not near the ottoman. The desk was Lord Percival's place of work. If the poison was applied here, it meant the glass had to be brought to the desk, contaminated, and then replaced on the ottoman before consumption. But when he returned to the body, he looked at the dead man's hands. Lord Percival had been an obsessive smoker of large, expensive Cuban cigars. The silver cigar box on the desk was open. LaBorde suddenly saw the flicker of a possibility, a momentary, infinitesimal gap in the continuous stream of time. The cigar. When they entered the study, Lord Percival must have, gone immediately to his desk to select his evening cigar, a habit well known to the staff and his intimate circle. This brief, distracting moment, a matter of 10 or 15 seconds, his back turned to the others, was the window. But who would have taken advantage of it? The 3 other men, Major Thorne, financial ruin, George Kellington, desperate poverty, primary heir, and Dr. Finch, an unknown motive, but a man who possessed the means, professional access to lethal substances. The logical structure of the crime was now clear. The killer, anticipating the ritualistic seating arrangement, had prepared the dose of the poison, the white powder seen on the desk, in a manner that allowed for its rapid application. When Lord Percival turned to his desk for his cigar, the killer had quickly dusted the poison onto the rim or inner wall of the predesignated host's glass on the ottoman. The act was swift, silent, and entirely concealed by the host's momentary, self-absorbed distraction. Now, LaBorde needed the motive and the means for each suspect, and most importantly, the fatal error that exposed the killer. The local constabulary, consisting of a weary, rain-soaked Inspector Davies and a single constable, finally arrived at Atheria House just after midnight, their arrival heralded by the grinding sound of their official car struggling up the long, gravel driveway. LaBorde, with a concise and impeccably logical presentation, established his own status as a disinterested witness and temporary custodian of the scene, a role that the clearly overwhelmed inspector was only too happy to permit. The hours that followed were dedicated to the formal, dreary business of evidence collection and the establishment of basic facts. The three suspects, Major Thorne, George Kellington, and Dr. Finch, were segregated in the library, a cold, unused room dominated by dusty volumes of theology and classical history. Ada Thornley and Gwendolyn Marsh were confined to the drawing room, attended by Mrs. Pendleton. The butler, Hilliard, and the footman were subjected to long, repetitive interviews concerning the movements of the port decanter and the exact sequence of events in the study. LaBorde used the time not for questioning, which was Inspector Davies's domain, but for gathering the atmospheric and biographical evidence. The widow, Ada Thornley, her motive was perhaps the most patent and the most easily dismissed. As the wife, she stood to inherit a massive sum, but the terms of Lord Percival's will, which Gwendolyn Marsh confirmed to LaBorde in a confidential aside, were structured to prevent her immediate financial freedom. She received a handsome allowance, a life interest in the estate, but no direct control over the principal, which was held in a complicated trust that only the executor, Gwendolyn Marsh, naturally, could manage. More critically, Lord Percival had recently uncovered evidence of a disastrous, secret investment Ada had made, forcing her into a state of acute, humiliating financial dependence, worse than before their marriage. Her motive was strong, but her physical opportunity was weak. She was with Miss Marsh and was never near the study or the glasses. The cousin, George Kellington, the poor, ineffectual cousin, was the one who, barring Ada, stood to gain the most immediate and absolute financial liberation. If Lord Percival died, and the will's conditions were met, he would receive a substantial, though not principal, lump sum payment sufficient to erase his considerable, accumulated debt and secure his future. His motive was desperation married to opportunity. He was present when the crime occurred. He had access to the glasses. But could he have carried out such a swift, calculated act? His personality spoke of timidity and a chronic inability to act decisively, a man of perpetual hesitation. The debtor, Major Quinton Thorne, the Major's motive was not gain, but survival. Lord Percival held the mortgage on the Major's entire property, a dilapidated but inherited estate in the Scottish borders, and more immediately, the promissory notes for a ruinous series of gambling debts. Lord Percival, Hilliard confirmed, had been intending to execute a foreclosure order the very next day. If Lord Percival died, the Major's debts would be dissolved, or at least suspended indefinitely amidst the legal chaos of the estate. The Major, a military man, possessed the psychological and practical capability for a swift, decisive act. He had the opportunity. The professional, Dr. Alastair Finch, Dr. Finch, the nervous physician, seemed to have no obvious financial or emotional tie to the victim beyond his professional duties. LaBorde considered this lack of motive to be, in itself, a crucial clue. Why would a man of Finch's character, a man who loathed disorder, commit such a spectacular act of violence? LaBorde instructed Inspector Davies to check the doctor's professional inventory for any missing or unaccounted-for substances, particularly fast-acting toxins. LaBorde was granted access to Lord Percival's ledger, the heavy, leather-bound volume from the desk. He spent a considerable amount of time simply reading the victim's meticulous, almost artistic handwriting, not for financial details, but for the personality it revealed. Lord Percival was not merely a wealthy man, he was a collector of other people's weaknesses, a predator who catalogued every single debt, every secret addiction, every minor social transgression of his dependents with chilling precision. It was within this ledger that LaBorde found the first, most damning piece of literary evidence, a short, hastily scribbled note, dated just 3 days prior, tucked into the section detailing George Kellington's debt portfolio. Kellington's pathetic attempts to secure financing from the city failed. He is ruined. Must ensure the new provisions in the codicil are activated tomorrow. His only hope, the minor bequest, must be erased. The codicil. This was the key. LaBorde immediately returned to Gwendolen Marsh. "Miss Marsh," he asked, his voice low, "I understand Lord Percival recently had a codicil added to his will. Can you confirm the nature of this document?" Miss Marsh, her posture as rigid as ever, adjusted her spectacles. "Yes, Monsieur LaBorde. It was signed just yesterday." Lord Percival, in a fit of, shall we say, displeasure, decided to entirely revoke the minor bequests to the extended family, including Mr. Kellington's £5,000, diverting the entire sum to a fund for the maintenance of the estate's rare orchid collection. This was devastating. Lord Percival had not just threatened to disinherit George Kellington, he had executed the final document of ruin. The death of Lord Percival before this codicil could be officially lodged and executed by the estate lawyers would invalidate the last-minute change, reverting the will to the previous version, which included the £5,000 bequest to George. This simple, bureaucratic detail provided George Kellington with a massive, time-sensitive motive. He had to kill Lord Percival before the next morning's post delivered the final, signed codicil to the solicitors. His motive was not just gain, but the desperate, immediate necessity of preserving a small gain from imminent destruction. His entire life depended on a window of less than 12 hours. The case against George Kellington now looked overwhelming: motive, opportunity, he was present, and the immediate, desperate timing. Inspector Davies, a man of simple, linear thinking, was ready to clap the handcuffs on the trembling cousin immediately. But LaBorde demurred. "Patience, Inspector. The grammar is too simple. The motive is too clean. The killer who acts with such precision is not a desperate, trembling amateur, but a person of methodical, disciplined calculation. George Kellington lacks the will for such an act. He is a man who hesitates before ordering a different kind of toast. He would not possess the iron nerve to poison a man under the eyes of 3 witnesses. The flaw lay in the logistics of the poisoning." LaBorde returned to the study and stared at the empty port glass on the carpet. The poison, the white powder, was on the desk. The glass had to be moved, poisoned, and moved back. He closed his eyes and reconstructed the scene again, focusing only on the movements. Entry: all 4 men enter the study. Hosts move. Lord Percival walks to his desk for his cigar. Back turned. The opportunity for application of the poison. The gap: while his back is turned, the killer must perform the following sequence. Step A: identify Lord Percival's glass, the one nearest his chair. Step B: grab the glass. Step C: move to the desk. Step D: dip the rim/interior of the glass into the prepared powder. Step E: replace the glass precisely in its original position on the ottoman. Step F: return to their seat. The pour: Hilliard pours the port. The drink: Lord Percival drinks. Steps C and D were impossible for George Kellington, Major Thorne, or Dr. Finch to perform without the other 2 witnesses seeing the blatant, audacious act of crossing the room and handling the glasses at the desk while Hilliard was still in the room, or while Lord Percival was within a foot of the poison source. The distance was too great, the act too clumsy for a rapid, silent execution. The killer did not leave their seat. The killer did not move to the desk. This meant the killer did not move, but the poison moved to the killer. LaBorde turned his attention to the one person who had been definitively ruled out because of lack of opportunity, Ada Thornley. She had been in the drawing room with Gwendolyn Marsh. She had no access to the study. She had no access to the glass. She had no access to the port. This was the classic Christie trap. The person who appears to have no opportunity is the one who created the opportunity with the most elaborate misdirection. LaBorde walked slowly back to the drawing room, the scene of the widow's grief. The room was now empty, the suspects having been moved to the library. He walked over to the silk divan where Ada had sat. He noticed the delicate, ornamental end table next to it. It held an antique silver vanity mirror and a small, exquisite porcelain dish, used for holding decorative sweetmeats. He picked up the porcelain dish. It was empty. It was perfectly clean. He placed it back down and looked at the nearby fireplace. He remembered the sequence of the evening. Pre-dinner sherry: Ada drank sherry from a glass, holding it by the heavy ruby ring. Dinner: Ada drank wine from a glass, served by the footman. Post-dinner dismissal: Ada went to the drawing room with Miss Marsh. The only person who had access to Lord Percival's private, specific port glass prior to the study was Hilliard, the butler, as he prepared the trays. LaBorde summoned Hilliard, who stood before him, impeccably stiff and utterly impassive. "Hilliard," LaBorde began, his voice soft, almost conspiratorial. "Tell me about the crystal glasses used for the port." "They are all identical, yes. But Lord Percival used an identical glass at dinner for his fortified wine." "Are these the same glasses?" "No, sir," Hilliard replied instantly, his voice a low monotone. "The dinner glasses are kept strictly separate from the after-dinner service. However, they are all the same pattern, yes. And the wine Lord Percival drank at dinner, his private reserve. Who poured it?" "I did, sir." directly from his private flask into his glass at his place setting, just before he entered the dining hall. No one else touches that flask. And when did you prepare the port glasses for the study? Immediately after the ladies retired, sir. I took the 4 port glasses from the cabinet, placed them on the tray, and brought the decanter from the cellar. This confirmed that the poisoning had to happen in the study, or the glasses had to be swapped. LaBorde returned to the logistical paradox. The glass must have been poisoned on the desk, but none of the suspects moved to the desk. He sat down again in the study, letting the entire evening repeat in his mind, focusing on the sensory details, the sounds, the smells, the subtle shifts in light. The smell of the room. Old leather, tobacco, and something else. A faint, almost imperceptible hint of a chemical, a scent that had been briefly masked by the heavy port and cigar smoke. He looked at the desk again. The tiny pile of white powder. He looked at the body. Lord Percival had been an avid, lifelong collector of rare, expensive fountain pens. Several gold-nibbed pens stood in a marble holder on his desk. And then, LaBorde saw it. A small, almost insignificant detail, a break in the pattern of organization. The study fire was laid, but it had not been lit. Lord Percival, being a man who liked to control the temperature, always insisted on a small fire. But it was not lit. Hilliard, when interviewed, had confirmed, the fire was not lit, sir. Lord Percival instructed me to lay the fire, but he preferred to light it himself. This meant that the fire was laid, ready to ignite with a single match. Paper, kindling, and coal were all present. LaBorde's eyes, moving slowly from the desk to the unlit hearth, finally fell upon the small, ornate silver box that sat beside the cigar box on the desk. This box was the key. He had assumed it was merely a decorative object. He picked it up. It was heavy, exquisitely carved, and empty. But the bottom of the box was lined with a soft, faded velvet, and on this velvet, there was a faint, almost invisible residue of white powder, identical to the cluster on the desk. This box was the poison container. The killer had prepared the poison, carried it in this box, placed the box on the desk, and then used the distraction of the cigar to apply the poison. But still, the logistical problem of crossing the room remained. LaBorde returned to the single moment of potential chaos, the fall of the glass. Lord Percival's glass had slipped from his hand and fallen a mere 6 inches onto the thick Persian carpet, landing without shattering, merely emitting a dull thud. But if the poison was instantaneous, why did Major Thorne and George Kellington not collapse as well? They had all drunk together. The port decanter was clean. Therefore, the poison was in the glass, and only Lord Percival's glass was poisoned. LaBorde suddenly realized the horrific, brilliant simplicity of the killer's plan. The entire logistical puzzle, the moving of the glass, the desk, the white powder, was a misdirection, a distraction of the murderer's own making, designed to lead the subsequent investigation into a logical, but false, dead end. The killer had not poisoned the glass before the pour. The killer had poisoned the glass during the drinking. LaBorde walked back to the library where the 3 suspects, Thorne, Kellington, and Finch, were waiting in a state of nervous exhaustion. He sent George Kellington out with Inspector Davies on the pretext of checking the garden gate, leaving the Major and the doctor alone. He faced Dr. Finch, the man who had the means but no clear motive. "Dr. LaBorde began, his voice quiet, tell me again the precise moment of Lord Percival's collapse. Was it simultaneous with the drinking, or immediately after?" Dr. Finch, clutching his small glass of water, swallowed nervously. "It was immediate. We all took a mouthful, perhaps two. He was the first to put the glass down. It was then. No more than 10 seconds. And your reaction, doctor?" "You leaped to his side immediately, professionally." "Of course. It was my duty." "And did you, at that moment, observe the precise state of the other 3 glasses?" "No, I was focused on the body." LaBorde then turned to Major Thorn. "Major, you were seated opposite Dr. Finch. When the Lord collapsed, where was your attention?" "On Percival, naturally." "Good God, it was a terrifying thing. You don't forget it. Tell me this, Major. When you raised your glass to drink, did you notice anything unusual about Dr. Finch's movements?" Major Thorn paused, wrinkling his brow, lost in the memory. "Unusual? No. He was nervous, as always. But he drank his port, just like the rest of us." "Did he, Major? Did he truly drink it?" LaBorde moved toward the doctor, his analytical gaze boring into Finch's pale, anxious face. "Dr. Finch, you possess the professional knowledge and access to certain fast-acting, lethal substances, correct? A poison that leaves little trace and acts with such devastating speed that it mimics a catastrophic cardiac event. A cyanide derivative, perhaps, or something far more exotic. Something you could justify having in a secured medical bag." Finch's face was now paper white. I refuse to answer without my solicitor." "Your refusal is noted, Doctor. But the logistics of your crime are quite clear to me now. You had no obvious motive, which was your greatest protection. But your true motive was not financial, but moral and professional. Lord Percival was not just a patient, he was a burden, a source of professional corruption, perhaps threatening to expose some minor malpractice, or simply a man whose unpleasantness had reached the limit of your professional endurance. The need for quiet, for order, was your true, deep-seated motive." LaBorde continued, his voice rising slightly, the final, methodical dismantling of the perfect crime. "You had the poison. You knew the routine. You knew you would be sitting near the ottoman. But you could not apply the poison to Lord Percival's glass beforehand. So, you chose a brilliant, appalling piece of misdirection. You poisoned your own glass." Major Thorn gasped, recoiling from the doctor. "His own glass? Are you mad, LaBorde?" "No, Major, merely observant." Dr. Finch took the glass nearest him. He took his mouthful of port. He then waited, for the precise moment of the host's collapse. When Lord Percival slumped forward, creating the catastrophic and blinding distraction, Dr. Finch, the professional, the caregiver, instantly leaped from his chair. But his first action was not to rush to the body. It was an infinitesimal deviation in his trajectory. LaBorde pointed an accusatory finger not at the doctor, but at the empty glass on the carpet. As you rushed to Lord Percival, Doctor, you performed a lightning-quick switch. You had already ingested a sip of port from your own glass, the poisoned one. As you knelt by the body, you swiftly exchanged your own poisoned glass for Lord Percival's clean, half-empty glass that was still resting on the ottoman. You did this under the cover of the sudden chaos and the Major's and Mr. Kellington's absolute shock. Lord Percival died from the clean port in the clean decanter because you poisoned his mouth, not his glass. LaBorde paused for dramatic effect, allowing the profound simplicity of the realization to settle. No, Doctor, you did not poison the glass. You poisoned the rim of your own glass with a substance that acts instantly on contact with the mouth and the slightest drop of liquid. You had a negligible amount of the toxin concealed in the inner cuff of your dinner jacket or on the back of your hand, a tiny, almost invisible dose that you transferred to the rim of your port glass when you reached for it on the tray. You took your sip, ensuring you were seen drinking, and then, at the moment of the Lord's death, you simply and professionally wiped the poison from your own glass onto the rim of Lord Percival's half-empty glass. And that, Doctor, is why Lord Percival died, and you did not. You were not swapping the contents, but transferring the fatal contact. Your glass, now clean, was placed, unnoticed, next to the body as you knelt to check his pulse. Lord Percival's glass, now bearing a fatal residue from the quick, silent transfer, was left on the ottoman, and subsequently, in the confusion, was taken by you to the desk to be accidentally smeared with the remaining white powder, the final, clever misdirection to convince the police that the poisoning had occurred on the desk, not in the chaos of the fall. Dr. Finch stood utterly rigid, the color having fled entirely from his face, leaving only the dark, burning intensity of his eyes. His posture, for the first time, lost its nervous tension and settled into a profound, terrifying stillness. The study fire was not lit, Doctor, LaBorde concluded, his voice barely a murmur. You had no need of the fire, only the ashes. A tiny amount of white ash, mixed with the crystallized poison, provides the perfect, almost invisible carrier, easily brushed off the desk after the application, leaving only the barest trace. The ultimate act of order, Dr. Finch. The removal of the disorder itself. The doctor did not speak, did not argue, did not confess. He simply looked at LaBorde with an expression of profound, weary defeat, the look of a man whose perfectly constructed linguistic framework of deceit had been taken apart, phrase by meticulous phrase, by the one man who understood the grammar of a perfect crime. He raised his hands slowly, submitting to the inevitable, the only sound in the room the nervous, shallow breathing of Major Thorne and the distant, mournful howl of the wind over Porthaven Bay, a sound that seemed to carry the entire weight of Atheria House's terrible, secret history. The subsequent hours were devoted to the necessary, somber cleanup of the intellectual and physical mess. Dr. Finch, upon interrogation by Inspector Davies, guided by LaBorde's precise analysis, confessed to the crime, detailing the use of a rare, fast-acting neurotoxin he had procured under the guise of an experimental anesthetic for a fictional rural practice, a substance so potent that a mere crystalline contact was sufficient for ingestion and rapid, absolute collapse. The motivation, as LaBorde had divined, was a complex, moral revulsion toward Lord Percival, who had threatened to ruin a vulnerable patient of the doctor's, a secret that now faded into the background, eclipsed by the sheer audacity of the execution. George Kellington, the trembling cousin, was exonerated and returned to the library, where he sat staring blankly at the portrait of a stern-faced ancestor, the weight of his newly salvaged inheritance a strange, unexpected burden on his shoulders. He was alive, he was rich, and his survival was owed entirely to the linguistic brilliance of the eccentric French academic. Major Thorne, now free of his ruinous debt, found a sudden, profound gratitude for the man who had exposed the murderer and, in doing so, removed his financial tormentor. He offered LaBorde a cigar, which the academic politely declined. The morning broke over Porthaven Bay not with the expected brilliance of post-storm clarity, but with a lingering, melancholic gray. The sea fog remained, though thinner now, hanging low over the wet, black slate of the roof tiles and the sodden lawn. The air was cool, clean, and carried the sharp, distinct scent of salt and earth. The terrible, oppressive tension that had permeated Atheria House had begun to recede, replaced by the profound, exhausted quiet that follows the resolution of a great and terrible drama. The stillness was almost deafening, a testament to the vacancy left by the violent removal of the house's master. Monsieur LaBorde stood at the drawing-room window, watching the inspector's car finally pull away, its tires crunching the gravel in a final, definitive salute to the close of the case. He was alone, and the solitude was a deep, satisfying balm to his highly organized mind. The entire incident, the murder, the investigation, the ultimate exposure, had been for him a magnificent, if grim, exercise in linguistic purity. The crime had been a perfect, intricate sentence, deliberately convoluted and obscured by red herrings and false clauses, but ultimately, it possessed a discernible and undeniable grammar. He, the linguist, had merely parsed the sentence, identifying the subject, the victim, the predicate, the action of poisoning, and the object, the transfer of the toxin. He turned away from the window, his attention settling once more on the details of the room itself. The velvet chairs, the dark oak, the faded crimson curtains, all now seemed to possess a renewed, quiet significance. The silence was deep, uninterrupted, a thick, palpable substance that seemed to absorb all sound, all anxiety. The house, stripped of its malevolent host and its violent secret, now felt utterly, profoundly empty, a vast repository of memory and shadows, a perfect place for the mind to finally, completely, release its hold on the waking world. LaBorde collected his coat and his worn leather satchel, a man ready to return to the orderly, predictable comforts of his books and his own small, meticulously arranged life. He cast one final, searching glance at the room, noting the precise reflection of the morning light in the polished wood of the mantelpiece, the faint, lingering scent of the extinguished fire, and the perfect, undisturbed stillness of the heavy air. The house was at rest. The case was closed. The analysis was complete. He departed Atheria House with the same quiet dignity with which he had arrived, leaving the estate to its somber, sea-soaked peace. The entire episode, now reduced to a series of logical steps and quiet observations, was receding rapidly in his mind, becoming no more than a faint, rhythmic echo, a soft, slow drumbeat of words and thoughts, utterly devoid of urgency or alarm. The final word had been spoken, the final truth revealed. There was nothing left but the calm, hypnotic certainty of the end of the narrative, the quiet, persistent progression toward the deep, untroubled silence. The silence of the house, the silence of the sea, the perfect, unchallengeable silence of the profound, consuming dark. Let the mind embrace this absence, this complete lack of demand. The story is over. The slow, heavy weight of the darkness descends, insistent and final. The mind is released.